the only absolute in the universe is the speed of light. Everything else is relative. When you think about God, he's the only absolute, right? So if he's saying I am like light, or light is like me, the physics, then he's first and foremost is that light is the only absolute quantity in the universe. Well, God's the only absolute. Everything else is relative. Everything's defined by the standard of God.
Where are we running to? Yeah, hold on to something good and true. You better. Welcome everyone to the Somewhat Helpful Podcast. I am very glad that you have joined us today. This is going to be a great episode, a great conversation that I have been looking forward to and waiting on with Dr. Doug Corrigan, whom I have followed for a while on Twitter, stumbled across his Twitter feed, and I'm going to read your little bio off of Twitter, and then you can elaborate that or change it or whatever you'd like to do. But I see that you are a Ph.D. biochemist and molecular biologist, and if that's not enough, you're also a physicist, award-winning global super solver, materials scientist, innovator, space enthusiast, and I would say you seem to know quite a bit about the human body and medicine as well. I don't know if you claim that as any sort of degreed specialty, but you definitely have helped me through that. So is that up to date? Is that correct?
That's correct. Started out as a physics guy, solid state, quantum physics. That's where I started my educational pathway. Worked with NASA for a number of years in microgravity missions, Oak Ridge National Lab, on solid state physics types materials research, and then decided to go back and get my PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology. And I studied more of the cellular microbiology, molecular biology, the nano stuff of what's going on inside the cells. So I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not an MD. I study things on a much smaller level. And so understanding the molecular biology is where I sort of headed.
I understand. Yeah, that's far beyond the scope of most people, but I'm very glad that there are individuals like you who decide to dive into that and then can make it understandable for people like me. And on that note, I would like to talk for a moment about your book, which has been phenomenal. The name of it is The Author of Light, and I'll have a link in the description for anybody that would like to pick that up. I picked this up a couple of weeks ago, and I've really, really enjoyed it. I like so the way that you described it, I think in a tweet, was this: in this book, I demonstrate how light, space, matter, time, and energy possess a unique signature that leads us to the identity of our Creator. So that's very understandable. What inspired you to write this book?
So what inspired me to write the book, I guess it goes all the way back to when I was a teenager, when I was 15 years old, real physics geek, studying physics as a teenager, really interested in it. So I was studying Einstein's special theory of relativity at the time, and didn't grow up in a home that was, let's say, a faith home. There was no religion really in our home of any sort. My parents didn't discuss that in the home. So,
Right.
and we hadn't been to church or any other type of religious thing. So when I was a teenager, I was kind of naive from that perspective, just like a sponge soaking up information. And so I was studying Einstein's theories of relativity. And then we had some friends that came over the house that were a husband and wife that were older and who had been friends of my stepmother, who had been traveling the world, or sort of like hippies at the time.
Yeah.
Traveling the world, trying to understand, what truth is, what the true, who the true God is, what religion seems to be the one that resonates with them the greatest. So they studied Eastern religions and traveled the world, understanding all of these different
Sure.
religions. So they came over our house one day when I was a teenager, and they said, we think we found the truth. We've been exploring all these different areas, and we think we found or came across the truth. And we were like, well, what is it? So don't keep it from us any longer.
Yeah, that's quite a statement. Yeah. We found the truth. Yeah.
So they were like Christianity, so the
Yeah.
Bible. So I hadn't been exposed to the Bible to this point, and so at this time they started inviting us to a church and to a youth group. I started going to a youth group.
And you were how old, you said, at the time?
15.
15. Okay.
It was either 14 or 15.
Yeah.
I think it was 15, and it was the first time I'm opening the Bible at all. First time, and I opened the first page of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and God said, "Let there be light." And He separated the light from the darkness, and that was evening, the morning of the first day. That whole prelude there really resonated with me. It really just struck me like a bolt of lightning, because I was studying in Einstein's special theory of relativity. I was studying about light. So
Right.
Einstein's theory of relativity has to deal with, it starts with the fundamental properties of what light is. Really. It's how he starts. And then from that understanding of what light is, all these other deductions can be made about space, matter, time, and energy that will just absolutely blow your mind.
Yeah.
Very counterintuitive things that we're not normally used to thinking of. And we can go over some of those things if we have time. But
Yeah.
So that struck me as, like that connection between God saying, "Let there be light," is the first thing He creates, and Einstein saying all space, matter, time, and energy derives from the physics of light.
Right.
Really.
So when you were 15, you were studying at that time Einstein's theory of special relativity. Am I saying that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And the same friend who had been traveling the world looking for the truth, he handed me an audio tape. Remember the old cassette tapes that you could wind up with a pencil?
Sure.
And I had a little Walkman, and I put it in there. He said, "You might be interested in listening to this." So I put in this cassette tape and started listening to it. And it was a man speaking in front of an audience, and I couldn't tell you for the life of me who this person was now. I don't have the tape anymore. I don't know who he was, but he was talking about the physics of light and how it relates to God. And so all these things were coming together at the same time.
Yeah.
And so this started a journey as I learned more and more about physics, as I went off to college and learned more about the physics of light, and then the new discoveries that were being made about light over the last several decades. It just accumulated so much. There was a tipping point where I said, I think this should be recorded in the form of a book.
Yeah.
And so I wrote The Author of Light. And basically, The Author of Light outlines 18 different properties of the physics of light that spell out who God is.
Yeah.
So
when did you complete the book?
When did I complete it?
Yeah.
I think it was 2 years ago.
Okay, so it's relatively new. Yeah.
2 years ago, I completed it. It's a short book, it's not a long book, and I wrote it for people who don't have a scientific background. You don't have to have a math background or a science background. I have people that read this book that are 80 years old, and the last time they had science was in high school, and they can, understand the book, and everything is conceptual in the book.
Yeah.
I don't know how you found it when you read it, but that's how I aimed writing the book, from a perspective of somebody not having a physics background or a science background.
Yeah, and I'm the perfect example of that. I do not have those backgrounds, and yet I was able to understand it very clearly. I think the examples that you give are very helpful. Like especially when understanding the distance and the train and really how everything is a matter of perspective. It's whose perspective are you measuring these things from? Maybe I guess I'm embarrassed to say that I'm pushing 40 and I could not have told you what Einstein's theory of special relativity was or anything about it. But after reading this, it really blew my mind. Like you said, a lot of these things are counterintuitive. You could probably go up to someone on the street and, for example, right, time does not change, right? Time is immutable. Time is constant. That if you made that proposition to someone on the street, most likely they would say yes. Time doesn't change, and the speed of time doesn't change. It's a immutable thing. But yet, as you show using Einstein's theory, that is not the case at all. If I understand it correctly, this will be a good test. Did I take away what I was supposed to take away? It seems like there's really only one constant out of all of these things that we think are constant, such as space, matter, time. The one constant that everything else is measured off of is the speed of light. Is that somewhat correct?
It's absolutely correct. You got the takeaway, so you get the prize. You get 100 on the quiz.
All right.
So yeah, that's it. And that's where Einstein started with. His initial assumption was that the speed of light is the same to all observers, regardless of your reference frame.
Yeah.
Which doesn't sound that odd, but when you actually start to delve into that, it's completely bizarre. So
it is.
So talking about the absolute nature of the speed of light being the only absolute quantity that's absolute in the universe, everything else is relative to that.
Wow.
Time is relative, mass is relative, distance is relative. These things that we normally think as constants. If I say this is the length of a 12-inch ruler, you would say, well, that's a standard absolute quantity that doesn't change. But it does change depending on the observer. A ruler could be a different length as someone else.
Yeah.
Depending on the reference frame. And it all comes back to the absolute nature of the speed of light. This is where he started his theory. And so it's kind of ironic that the theory is called the theory of relativity. When light is the absolute. So light is absolute, but everything else that we think of that's normally absolute is relative.
Yeah.
And it changes depending on your frame of reference.
Right. Yeah. I'll tell you one of the statements that you made that kind of helped me understand it was when you were talking about observing a hypothetical light beam from different positions, different observers. And you explained how if I were stationary from whatever I consider stationary. I know we're all moving around the galaxy and, on planets at different speeds. But let's say from my point of reference right now, if I were to observe and measure a beam of light, it would be traveling at the speed of light. What is that? Do you know that speed offhand? You've probably written it enough, but.
Yeah, so it's 186,282 miles per second.
Yeah, it's pretty quick.
Or 30 million meters per second.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really 186,000 miles per second.
Yeah. So it would seem that. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So if I were to measure somehow the speed of that light beam, it would appear to be going that speed from where I was standing. However, if I were to move in the same direction as that beam of light, even coming up close to that speed, it would still seem to me to be moving at that same speed away from me, which is, I can't even process that. You wrote, one of the things you wrote, remember, even if you could conjure up enough energy to reach 99.99999 in perpetuity percent the speed of light, a beam of light would still whiz past you at exactly the speed of light. You can't even begin to catch it. And it's hard to even conceptualize that. But yet that's been proven mathematically, right? Through these years.
And experimentally, it's been proven as well. Time and time again, Einstein's special theory of relativity is one of the most proven theories out there, as well as his general theory. But going back to that nature of the speed, I mean, think of yourself in a car moving at 60 miles per hour.
Yeah.
If somebody stationary on the side of the road standing there would measure your car moving at 60 miles per hour.
Mm-hmm.
But if they got in a car and started moving alongside you, and they were traveling 60 miles per hour alongside of you, they would look out their window, and if they didn't see the trees whizzing past, they just saw your car. Like say you're out in the middle of space, each moving at 60 miles per hour, and there's nothing else around you. You would each look at each other and think the other car wasn't moving.
Right.
The relative speed between your two cars would be 0 miles per hour. You would think the other car wasn't moving. So speeds that we normally think of with normal everyday objects like cars and balls and whatever else that's made out of matter, when you think about those speeds, all those speeds are relative. They add and subtract. When you say the speed of something, it's always with respect to the speed of something else.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a car moving towards another car, let's say one car is moving at 60 and the other car is moving at 60, and they're about to have a head-on collision, the speed, the relative speed between those two cars is 120 miles
Right.
per hour, right? And that collision is going to occur at 120 miles per hour, not 60. And so speeds add and subtract based on the two different reference frames. So the relative, there is no such thing as absolute speed when you're talking about physical objects. But with light, that's completely different. The way speed works is completely different. The speed of light is 186,000 miles per second, regardless of your frame of reference. So as you pointed out, if you were moving alongside the speed of light, at the speed of light or near to the speed of light, that light beam will move past you at the speed of light. Yeah. And if somebody else was measuring that same light beam, and they were, say, stationary, they would measure that same light beam as moving at the speed of light. Right. So, you can't argue that, well, the speed of light, the light beam knew I was trying to catch it, and so it made itself faster so that, it would still be moving past me at the speed of light. Well, that light beam would have to be have multiple personality disorder, because 100 different observers all moving at different speeds would measure that same light beam moving at the speed of light. So how can it be moving at different speeds for each different person?
Yeah, it's wild.
So that's the only absolute quantity in the universe. Everything else is relative. So this is where I started to, look at this and say, well, these things parallel the very nature of God.
Yeah.
Because God said, let there be light. And not only did he say, let there be light, but he also says multiple times in the Bible that he is light. Mm-hmm. So I don't believe that God is physically a light beam or riding on a light beam or something like this. What I believe is that when God created the actual rules that generate physics of light, he had an arbitrary, palette in front of him where he could have made whatever rules he wanted.
Sure.
He could have created the rules of physics however he wanted. He could have made gravity repel things. He could have made like charges attract instead of repel. He could have changed the physics of everything. He had an arbitrary palette that he could have basically, he had, arbitrary, freedom over all the rules.
Whatever he wanted. Blank canvas.
Right. So, so you can think of it two different ways. When God had this arbitrary blank canvas, did he just randomly pick rules and say this would be a cool way for, everything to work? Or did he say, let me choose rules that tell a story about who I am so that people would know who the true God is? So, and no one else has control over these laws. Like, I can't change the laws of physics. You can't, no one can change the laws of physics. There's only one person who has control over the laws of physics, and that is God. So if he were to embed his very signature nature into the laws themselves, no one could argue that anyone else ever, did it. It would have to be him that did it, and it couldn't change. So starting with that thought that, when somebody makes or creates something, they put their signature on it, like an artist puts their signature on the painting. Or somebody creates a car, they put their emblem or logo or trademark on it. Everything gets a serial number, a trademark, a logo. Everything that's created has an identifying mark of who created it. So why wouldn't the universe be any different? Why wouldn't God embed into the physics signatures that spell out exactly who made the laws and who he is?
Yeah.
So this is where how the book started. And if you look at all the physics of light, space, matter, and time and energy, you find 18 different characteristics of those laws,
right,
that perfectly match who God is, but not just God in general, but the God that's described in the Bible.
Yeah. one of the things I loved about the book is it challenges you. It challenges your view of your concept of who God is, and it makes you realize, or gives you the opportunity to realize, that God is much, much bigger and wiser and more powerful than we could ever even hope to begin to conceptualize. Like, if we can't even understand these ideas that you're talking about, like we can say them, but I cannot really imagine in my head like what the things you're telling me about speed. I try, but it's very difficult. And if that is just one of the things of the signature of God, imagine God is the one who came up with that. He's the one that designed that. So I think science, one of the greatest things about science is that it can allow us to broaden our perspective of how great God is. And no matter how far we go, we'll never even come close to his actual greatness and his actual power. So that's when you get into, terms like omnipotence, which we can say that, but what does that really mean? Omnipotence. We can't begin to conceptualize what all power actually is. So yeah, so I love that part of the book. But if you had to pick, as you mentioned, there are 18 different connections that you make between the physics of light and the nature of God. If you had to pick, let's say 3 or 4 of the most impactful to you, can you give a brief description of those?
Yeah, we'll start with the one with the speed, right? So
Yeah.
light is the only absolute in the universe is the speed of light. Everything else is relative. When you think about God, he's the only absolute, right? So if he's saying I am like light, or light is like me, the physics, then he's first and foremost is that light is the only absolute quantity in the universe. Well, God's the only absolute. Everything else is relative. Everything's defined by the standard of God.
Yeah.
He is the absolute standard. And in the Bible, he says, I am who I am.
Mm-hmm.
I am the standard. So God creates the standard. He is the only absolute. Everything else is relative to God. Everyone else sees God as the same. Doesn't matter what your reference frame is, who you are, what religion you are, what background you're from. Everyone who sees God will see the same God. There's not a relative difference in who God is. You can't make God to be whoever you want him to be.
Right.
So God is an absolute. So that's probably my favorite one. And that's the top. That's the top of the pyramid. Everything else flows from that. All the other laws that come from the physics of light start with the fact that it's the absolute standard. So move on. Let's move on to one other. So for the speed of light to be constant, other things have to change to make that happen. Meaning, how do you measure speed? You measure speed by measuring the length that something travels, and you measure the amount of time that it travels in. You divide those two numbers and you get the speed, right?
Yeah.
So if the speed of light is staying the same, no matter what your reference frame is, then that means distance and time have to be changing for different observers to make the speed of light the same. And that's how all the math flows out to create the special theory of relativity. So if you look at the first one, which is time, how does time change? So this is what Einstein was famous for, was being able to do these thought experiments in his own mind to try to figure out what would happen to time if the speed of light was absolute. And what he came up with was that if you're traveling at a certain speed in a spaceship or a car or whatever, an airplane, you're walking, you're moving, your clock, okay, that you have in your hand or on your spaceship, it appears to be moving at a certain rate to you. That doesn't appear to change for you, no matter how fast you're going. So if you're going half the speed of light, your clock is moving at the same rate to you as if you were moving 90% the speed of light. You wouldn't think anything was happening with respect to how time is flowing. But somebody outside of your spaceship with their own clock, they're stationary, and they see your spaceship move by. Let's say there's a window looking in, peering in, and they could see that hand on the watch ticking. Okay, so let's say that, they could watch the speed of that hand moving on that clock. That clock to them would appear to be moving much slower. than what you're measuring it as. So your clock would be moving slower compared to their clock.
Yeah.
Now, the faster you go, towards the speed of light, the slower your clock will be moving to someone else looking at your clock. To you, the clock seems normal. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it will continue to move slower. This is called time dilation. And it will continue to move slower such that if you actually could reach the speed of light, which you can, but if you could get to the speed of light, the clock would stop. So at that point, if you were moving at the speed of light, you were a light beam, your clock would not move at all, meaning you wouldn't experience any time at all.
Yeah.
Meaning every point in time, past, present, and future, is occurring to you right now.
That
There
almost
is no
seems like
such
something we would read in the Bible about God, doesn't it?
Yeah. So, like, that's the second property. God is timeless. Past, we know the future. How does he? The future is now. He sees it all at one time. He sees all time at one time, which is what would happen theoretically to you if you could get to the speed of light. You would become timeless.
Yeah.
Just like God. Now we can't get to the speed of light. We can't reach that speed. And so the reason we can't get to the speed of light. The reason we can't is because of another property that changes when you start moving towards the speed of light. As you start moving towards the speed of light, not only does your clock move slower, but your mass, the amount of mass you have, increases. Okay, now you don't notice this change occurring. You think you have the same amount of mass. But somebody else stationary looking at you and could measure your mass would see that your mass is actually more.
So my muscles would grow, right? So if I want to just instead of working out, I can just travel faster.
Yeah. So you don't get bigger and you don't look bigger. If somebody could measure the amount of mass that you have, it would be greater. And so your mass increases as you approach the speed of light. And this is why we can't move any object to the speed of light. So what would happen is if you move to the speed of light, your mass would become infinite.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you're moving at half the speed of light, and now you want to go to 3/4 the speed of light. You need a certain amount of energy to accelerate.
Right.
But as you accelerated to 3/4 the speed of light, your mass has now increased a certain amount. Now, if you want to go from 3/4 to say 90%, you need more energy than you did to go from half to 3/4 because your mass is greater, so it takes more propulsion to accelerate a larger mass to the next speed. So your mass keeps increasing, which means you need more and more energy to get to the next speed, which means that it's just like a never-ending cycle.
Right.
And basically what happens is it goes off to infinity, meaning you would need an infinite amount of energy to actually get to the speed of light. The best we've ever done here on Earth, we've taken particles, small particles, like the inside of the nucleus of an atom, like a proton or a neutron or an electron. We've taken those subatomic particles, which are light, pretty light, or small in mass, and we've taken those and accelerated them around linear accelerators or cyclotron accelerators and moved them to about 99.999% the speed of light. And we've pumped in a lot of energy, like the Large Hadron Collider on the border of Switzerland and France, that which has a 16 kilometer circumference under the 300 feet under the Earth, accelerating protons at 99.99% speed of light. They've had to pump in 17 tera electron volts of energy to get protons to move at that speed. What's happened is their mass has become so great that it would take an infinite amount of more energy to get them to the speed of light. So if you could get to the 99.9999999% the speed of light, if you took all the energy in the universe and put it on your spaceship and converted it into energy and propelled yourself forward, and you got to, let's say 99 with 8 nines after it, you would still need an infinite amount of energy to go that little extra amount.
Yeah.
And a light beam would still pass you at the speed of light. So,
Yeah.
so
Wow.
you still wouldn't be, to the speed of light. So this is
Yeah.
the other part of God, is that we're finite creatures,
Yeah.
and God is infinite. We always say
Yeah.
He's omnipotent. He's all powerful. He's infinite in knowledge, infinite in wisdom, infinite in power, infinite in strength. Humans cannot ever become God, no matter how much they try. They cannot evolve. They cannot gain enough power or strength to become God. They're always infinitely away from
Yeah.
God, just like we're always infinitely away from reaching the speed of light. So God is the only one with enough energy to move something to the speed of light. So God is not only the only absolute quantity, He's timeless, but He's omnipotent. He's
Yeah.
all powerful. He has an infinite amount of power and
Yeah.
strength.
Yeah.
So that's another one.
Well,
Moving on.
it's a great book, and I would just say pick it up and you won't regret it. And I appreciate how it's accessible for, I would say, early teens on. It's accessible to anybody in that age range. And as we were sitting here talking, I thought of how many more families are homeschooling nowadays, and this would, I think, be a great
Yeah.
resource for homeschool kids as well. Do you have a preferred place to pick that up, as far as on your website or Amazon, or does it?
Amazon's good. Just go to
Yep.
Amazon and get the Author of Light,
Yeah.
by Corrigan. I think there's another book called The Author of Light or something similar.
Yeah, we'll show the
It's not
cover
about
here and
something
make sure
else.
we provide the link so that they get the right one. But
Yeah.
yeah,
So
it's great, man.
the other interesting thing, real quick, before you
Uh-huh.
jump off that topic, is that as you start to look at these other features of space, matter, time, and energy, you start to see the Trinity. You start to see
Right.
the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Jesus, the Father, the Holy Spirit, embedded in the characteristics of the physics of light
Yeah.
in many, many different ways. So
Yeah.
it gets very specific. So it doesn't just start, God is omnipotent and all powerful and timeless and omnipresent.
Hmm.
So you see that. You also start to see very specifics about specific features of who God is, and you start to see the gospel actually played out in the death, the burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, is also embedded in the physics of how light interacts with physical matter.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so the whole story of the gospel, from God, the Father, the Son, Holy Spirit, and the gospel, is all presented
Yeah.
in the physics of light, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah. I got through about 5 or 6 chapters, and I thought, this has got to be it. What's the rest of the book? And it just kept going deeper and deeper and making more and more connections. And as you were talking about, so yeah, really enjoyed it. Moving on, changing topics drastically here. As I mentioned, I think I mentioned at the top of the podcast, if I haven't, the way that I stumbled across your work was following you on Twitter, as I was looking for information regarding COVID and the vaccines, and just the craziness that we've went through in the past 3 years or so. I had a wife that was almost due with our first biological child at the time, and so I was probably a little more. I paid a little more attention than normal about what was going on, as I was concerned for her health and the baby and stuff. And I began to see that when I looked at the actual data and the actual reasoning, it didn't seem to match what was on the news, and it really just took me down about a 3-year rabbit hole of losing. I would say, for me personally, losing an immense amount of trust in our health regulatory agencies. But thankfully, there were voices like yours and others who were continuing to put out reasoned discourse about where we were and where this might go, and helping people to just try to do the best they could and understand what was going on. I'll say I just stumbled across one of the most recent posts I think you had that was titled, "Is the spike protein from the mRNA vaccines toxic to the human body?" Is that one you wrote recently, that post or article?
Yeah. That's a very recent one.
Yeah. Well, what I appreciated about that was you touched on a lot of different topics that I've heard bits and pieces from other doctors or other researchers, and you kind of tied a lot of it together in that article. So I'll post a link to that as well. But with that said, generally overall, what has been your experience over the past 3 years from what you've learned and seen, and where were you 4 years ago with our healthcare system, and where are you today? And just tell me a little bit of your story through this, because you have more
Yeah,
knowledge,
so
obviously, about the specifics than most people would.
I'm not a stranger to big pharma. So I started a biotechnology company after I graduated and got my Ph.D. in biochem. I started a company that we developed research and development tools for the big pharma
Mm-hmm.
to help them discover drugs quicker and faster. And so I was immersed in big pharma and how it all operates for many years. And along that journey, my wife was exploring natural health. It wasn't something that I had on my radar. I was more trained in the Western medicine school of thought, but she was exploring natural health. And so some of the things that she researched and was able to show me by using certain products in our home, on our children and on us, started to change my thinking around natural health, and that there's other ways of achieving health other than the traditional Western approach.
Right.
And so I started researching those topics. So that was before COVID came around.
Right.
Several years before. And so I might have had a different response to what happened with COVID if it had caught me in the days where I was more tuned into Western medicine and thinking that was the only approach to things. But when COVID first occurred, when the coronavirus was first sort of unleashed in January, February, March, those 3 months of 2020, I'll be truthful. I tell people this all the time. I was scared.
Yeah.
Like I thought this was like going to be Ebola or something, and that was partly because of the videos that they were showing coming out of China, and people collapsing in the street, and people being welded shut into their apartment complexes, people convulsing in the street, people million square foot hospitals being built in 7 days. Yeah. With large smokestacks behind the hospital to burn the dead bodies. And then when the virus finally came here, I think it was in Washington when it first arrived here on our shores. The first person who got it brought it into a nursing home, and I think every person in that nursing home died.
Wow.
And so you saw this data, and then they started with all the ventilators and people were dying. So yeah, I was scared at the beginning. I was telling my wife not to touch anything, wear the mask, do all these things. So I was scared, I would say it was probably April, May, in that range where I was starting to see that the virus was not as lethal as they were either making people believe or people were believing at the time through the media and all the other images they were showing us. And so my thinking started to change. And as you have the fight or flight fear response, then you have the logical centers of your brain that start to take over. So the logical centers of my brain started to take over after a few months. And that's when I started to really think rationally about it. And the first thing that really hit me was that there's other coronaviruses that have been circulating around for over 100 years or even longer than that cause the common cold, and all of us have been exposed to them, including ones that produced a spike protein very similar to the spike protein with this coronavirus, but it causes the common cold. Most adults have been exposed to one of these other 4 coronaviruses throughout their lives. There's HKU1, OC43, NL63. and 229E. Those are the 4 other strains of coronavirus, 2 alpha coronaviruses and 2 beta coronaviruses. The coronavirus that we're dealing with now is a beta coronavirus, but it's very similar in genetic sequence and structure and form and function to the other coronaviruses and how it operates. And so this was something that the media wasn't telling people.
Mm-hmm.
This wasn't being shouted from the rooftops, that because this mattered, because a lot of the population had T cells, memory T cells, and B cells that were cross-reactive to the proteins. They had gained immunity from being exposed to one of these other coronaviruses, and certain portions of their immune response were reactive to this new coronavirus.
Right. So in layman's terms, because our bodies had experienced something similar in the past, it wasn't like this was just this completely novel thing that would that our immune system would be totally unprepared to fight off. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Right. Yeah, and there's lots of papers that show that the T cells are responsive to this new coronavirus. The T cells that we have programmed into us from previous exposures of other coronaviruses, they're completely and totally reactive to this new coronavirus.
Mm-hmm.
And so this wasn't shared with people. So that was part of the fear factor, I think, that was going into this, making people believe that this was a novel coronavirus. They gave it the name, the novel coronavirus, to hammer it into people's minds that this was something like we've never seen, like maybe like the bird flu or or like Ebola or something else that we've never seen before, that would just have a 50% kill rate or something like this. So when we started looking at the infectious fatality ratios, and Ioannidis, who's a great epidemiologist at Stanford, had started publishing papers on the real infection fatality ratio, meaning out of how many people get infected, how many of them actually end up dying.
Right.
It was such incredibly small numbers for most age groups. In my age group, it was like 0.08% chance of me dying from the coronavirus if I got infected.
Right.
0.08% chance. And then children, they were down in the 0.00, 2 decimal places and then a number.
Yeah.
The elderly people, they were up in the, like above 70, they were like at 5%.
Mm-hmm.
So if they were infected, there was a 5% chance of them dying. But in my age group, it was 0.08. And so I looked at that and I said, I'd rather take my chances with the virus than with an unknown technology that's never been tested on humans before.
Right.
And this is not like any other vaccine that's ever been developed before.
Yeah. So let me ask you to elaborate on that, because that was something that I stumbled across. I can't remember how, again, not having a medical background, I can't remember how I went down that road. But when I began to study this a little bit, I saw that the mRNA housed in a lipid nanoparticle. Is that correct? So that it could permeate the cell wall. So again, I'm an untrained guy, but I could Google this and figure out how this worked, and saw enough, graphics and explanations to go, okay, well, that makes sense. And it also makes sense that this has never been deployed there's never been a trial of this mRNA vaccine technology that has ever went through the entirety of clinical testing and passed. And here we were being promised that there was going to be no long-term effects from this. I mean, that's not done in medicine, as far as I know, and up to this point in history. Am I wrong there?
How can you make yeah, exactly. How can you make a promise that there's going to be no long-term effects if you don't have any data on long-term effects?
Right. Yeah.
So that's a lie. That's how you would define a lie, basically.
Yeah.
You can extrapolate all you want, but until you actually have the data to say that, you shouldn't be saying there's going to be no long. The honest thing would be to say, hey, we're doing a completely new technology. We don't know what its long-term effects are. We have no clue.
Yeah.
And if you want to take it, you can. here's the actual chances of you dying if you get infected with the coronavirus. Here's the infection fatality ratio for your age group, and here's what we think what the vaccine will do to help improve that. And by the way, we don't know what the long-term health impact is.
Yeah.
If they had said something like that, that would have been a lot more honest, a lot more transparent, and then let just people make their own decision. But instead, they sold it as something they didn't have they were writing checks their mouths were writing checks their bank account couldn't cash.
Yeah.
They didn't have the data to prove what they were actually telling the public.
Yeah.
And so there was this mass propaganda campaign. Everyone was aligned with this, the media, the government, big pharma. It was like they were all beating to the same drum in what they were saying to the public. And so you didn't have any dissenting voices, which was kind of strange.
Right.
Now, with the new technology where there's unknown safety into the future on reproduction, fertility rates, all of that, without that knowledge, without that database of information, how come everyone is basically saying the same thing?
Yeah.
So that's a big red flag that something's not right with the whole system.
And I know, again, from my layman's research, that there have been many pharmaceutical products that were given the green light to market that after 5 or 10 years, they were pulled because there was all of these unexpected hazards that were caused by these products. I mean, you see the commercials every day. If you took so-and-so, or if you were on this, then, join our class action lawsuit. So that's common to see. So it was definitely interesting. And I think for me, the frustrating part was when I talked to other individuals that I knew, friends and family members and stuff, if the people that I talked to only listened to mainstream media, just turn on your TV at night and CNN, NBC, ABC, whatever, they were totally oblivious to the things that you and I are discussing right now, those possible dangers. And it would seem like if you're looking out for the best, if your concern is really for the individual, that you would want to give them all the information possible and allow them to make the decision that's best for them or for their family. But that's not at all, as you mentioned, that's not what we saw from the pharmaceutical companies. It's not what we saw from the government. It's not what we saw from the media. It really shook to the core my trust in these agencies that I had in my entire life.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And the other thing that was a big red flag was this insane level of interest the government was suddenly taking in everyone's health to the point of insanity. And they never had shown any interest in people's health before that. Why aren't they trying to deal with the fentanyl issue? Why aren't they dealing with obesity? Why aren't they dealing with diabetes? Why aren't we getting the red siren, full court pressed top-down health approach from the government to the same extent that they did with COVID? Why don't they do that with all the other diseases and things that are affecting mankind at even greater levels than what COVID ever did? It's only with COVID, for some reason, that they take such a big interest in our health. And so that's a huge red flag right there, that there's something else behind this that doesn't meet the eye. So people that can connect dots and see what's happening, they and are willing to at least question the narrative of what they're being told through the media, at least to step back and say, does this pass the litmus test? Does this pass the sniff test? And to me, it didn't. None of the things added up. And so it was very obvious there was an agenda behind it. There was an agenda behind it. What that agenda is, people can argue about. There's lots of theories of what that agenda is and who's driving the agenda. It could be competing interests, with different motives. It could be profit in one part of the sector. The pharma is just worried about money. That's their motive. The government might have a different agenda. But I think all of these agendas aligned so that they could come to the public as a united front and say, you have to take this vaccine. No ifs, ands, or buts.
Yeah. And I think you're correct on that. There are many different incentives. And that's one of the things that when I began to, in my adult life, finally learn critical thinking, thank you to Thomas Sowell and some of the things he wrote. One thing I learned was look at people's incentives, figure out why they might be saying what they're saying. And I think there's a lot of different incentives, whether it's money, whether it's power, whether it's, whatever for all of these individuals. So it's kind of hard to, although I think many people would like to say, well, here is the problem. Well, yeah, that's one of, 100 problems. And we can talk about the 99 other problems as well. But it for whatever reason, all of those perverse incentives worked to create this perfect storm almost situation over the past 3 years. So it has really been odd. I'll say that.
That definitely has been odd.
Yeah.
We've never experienced anything like it, probably in the history of America,
Yeah.
It's a very odd confluence of things taking place at the same time. And I think people are wiser now. So if there's another pandemic or whatever,
I hope so. Yeah.
People will start to be more questionable about the response and what the government is actually telling us to do.
Would you mind giving just a few bullet points from the recent article you wrote? Because as I mentioned, the one that's titled "Is the spike protein toxic to the human body?" As I mentioned, it really takes several different points that I had heard and seen from different papers and seen from different doctors and researchers, and kind of puts it together into an easy to read format. So, what do you recall from that article as being some of the primary points that you wanted to get across to people?
So the spike protein is, some people may not know, but when you take the vaccine, you're not being injected with spike protein. You're being injected with genetic instructions that go into your cells, and those genetic instructions hijack those cells and tell your cells to start producing or synthesizing the spike protein from the coronavirus. Not the entire coronavirus, but one part of the coronavirus. Your cells are being hijacked to manufacture. That's never been done with a vaccine before. With a vaccine, it's always been either a protein or injecting into you. It's already been made. Yeah. So they would have injected you with the spike protein, let's say. Or they would have injected you with the virus that's been attenuated or inactivated, or, basically killed, so that it can't replicate in your body, but you're being exposed to all the components of the virus. But your cells aren't making the virus itself, basically. So with this vaccine, which is unlike any other vaccine, it's actually hijacking your cells, wherever the lipid nanoparticles go, and whatever tissues they happen to permeate into and embed into those cells will then start manufacturing the spike protein and just start chugging out more and more spike protein. Mm-hmm. So that's, and the theory is, well, your body will start to recognize that spike protein, develop antibodies to it, so that the next time you're exposed to something with a spike protein, like the coronavirus, your immune system will recognize it and take it out of commission. And so that's the theory behind it. Sounds great, but the question was never asked, should we be telling ourselves to make the spike protein? Is there any toxicity to the spike protein itself?
Do you really think that question, that just blows my mind? What, did nobody stop and say, hey, maybe this is harmful? Maybe this protein that our own cells now are going to be synthesizing, maybe this is a harmful thing.
Do you think that was never asked? It was never asked by any of the pharma, by the government, by the FDA, by the regulators. Never asked. Wow. And obviously you're not that stupid not to ask that question. It's just bury your head in the sand and don't bring it up, and hopefully people don't think to ask it.
Wow.
And so the question is, is the spike protein toxic to the human body? And now that, study after study after study has come out and been published in peer-reviewed journal articles, indeed, yes, the spike protein is toxic to reproductive tissue, brain tissue, heart tissue, blood vessels, you name it, it seems to be toxic to that tissue. So the question is, where is the spike protein being produced in your body? How long does the spike protein hang around in your body? And at what concentrations? And so we're starting to get data that shows how long the spike protein will be produced by your cells, which wasn't really dealt with early, before the vaccine was rolled out. They just said, well, it'll be localized to the muscle tissue in your arm, and you might produce spike protein right there locally for 2 weeks or less, and then it's localized in time and space in your body. But now we know that's false. Basically, spike protein can we know at least go for 4 months in someone's body, and circulates throughout the entire body on these small lipid vesicles called exosomes, which your cells churn out after they make the spike protein. They'll churn out exosomes. They're like little lipid vesicles that have the spike protein decorating the surface of those little lipid vesicles. But you also have free spike protein, not in exosomes, circulating in your blood plasma as well. And from there, once it gets into your systemic circulation and go throughout your entire body, and so you have spike protein entering in and interacting with all your tissues. Is that spike protein toxic? Yes. So there's a number of ways that happens. One way is that the spike protein interacts with a receptor that most of our cells and tissues have on the cell surface called ACE2. So ACE2 is a receptor that's used for blood pressure control, but also the regulation of amino acids and other cellular processes are governed by the ACE2 receptor. The spike protein can actually engage with, bind to the ACE2 receptor, and cause our cells to downregulate and not produce the ACE2 receptor. So not only is it interfering with the normal function of ACE2 because it's blocking it, right? It's also telling your cells to make less of it. And so when you look at, say, for example, the cells that line the inner lining of your vessels, and the endothelial cells that make ACE2 receptor, when they're exposed to the spike protein, they produce less ACE2, and those states go into a process of hyperinflammation, and they basically, the mitochondria, which are the organelles inside the cell that are the energy factories inside our cell, the mitochondria start to fragment and break up into smaller pieces. So there's a fragmentation process that occurs of the mitochondria, and those cells go under a highly inflammatory oxidative stress, and that destroys those cells basically. And then from there, you're going to have damage to the inner lining of your vessels, blood clotting, and everything else that comes along with it. So that's one interaction. The other, the spike protein will interact with a protein called neuropilin-1. Neuropilin-1 is another receptor that's in nervous tissue and in blood vessel tissue, and it's used in patterning and development of blood vessels, lymphatic tissue, and nerves, basically in your central nervous system. So those cells know where to grow and where to go. The patterning and development of those in early development is being governed by neuropilin-1. But not only as an embryo and a young child, but also as an adult, when you have to spawn new blood vessels to grow around, a clot or a hardening or a constriction of blood flow, you'll grow new blood vessels. That's governed by neuropilin. When you have a tumor, and blood vessels start growing towards that tumor to metastasize it and feed it with more nutrients so it'll grow and become a tumor. That's a process called angiogenesis, and that's governed by neuropilin. So spike protein interacts with that neuropilin, which can affect patterning and development of vessels and nervous tissue, as well as interfere with the process of cancer and other things. So, so we know that the spike protein is toxic to many tissues, and we're finding not only from the vaccine, but from the virus itself. So people infected with SARS-CoV-2 and have COVID-19 are finding that most of the deleterious effects of the virus itself is coming from that spike protein. The spike protein has a number of features embedded in it. It has regions that look a lot like some of the proteins in our body. It's called molecular mimicry, so it means you can develop autoimmune reactions from it. There's areas that are which are super antigens called like Staphylococcus enterotoxin B, SEB, which is a super antigen which create anaphylactic shock and toxic shock syndrome in your body. There's an area of the spike protein that looks like the same toxins in snake venom. So there's these different regions in the spike protein, not only interact with ACE2 and neuropilin and other receptors, but areas that will produce these hyperinflammatory or very skewed immune responses. And so those are all in that spike protein. And that's what we're telling people to continually be exposed to, not only after one dose or two dose, but the third, the fourth, the fifth. People are on their fifth dose, so their body is now producing spike protein over and over and over again. It's the same. And the other thing that we realize is that the spike protein that they're producing is the same spike protein that the original ancestral strain from Wuhan, the original genetic sequence for that spike protein is what's used in the vaccine. Even in the bivalent vaccines, they still have that ancestral sequence as one of the spike proteins in there. But the virus has mutated since then. It's what they call attenuated, meaning that the nucleotides inside the genome have basically changed, and the virus is attenuated to become less lethal over time. And this is a normal process virus goes through. It enters into a population, it'll mutate, and its genetics will change such that it becomes less lethal. Attenuation. And so this is what's happened. You can actually follow the infection fatality ratio over time, and you can see it drop exponentially and then basically reach a plateau at a very low number as the virus is attenuated and mutated. So, but they're still injecting people with the original spike protein. But the people that are being infected now with COVID are not being exposed to that spike protein anymore. There's been lots of mutations to that spike protein since that initial, initial strain of the virus. So, why keep injecting people with the same genetic sequence from an old spike protein that was more toxic, and that is really not training their immune system to recognize the new spike protein? So there's lots of other things we can go into. But that's sort of a snapshot. There's things like original antigenic sin that you have to deal with and think about. There's a thing called antibody-dependent enhancement you have to worry about. The other thing to worry about is that, you're the first time you get the first shot of that vaccine, your body produces antibodies, T cells, B cell response to the spike protein. The second time you get the shot, now your immune system's primed to attack any tissue producing the spike protein. It's going to see whatever tissue makes the spike protein the second time around as a foreign invader. So your immune system will target those tissues through T cells, cytotoxic T cells, the complement system, through natural killer cells. Those cells will go and target those cells and kill them, basically. So if it's the inside lining of your blood vessels that are expressing the spike protein, that's what's going to get destroyed. So every time you get exposed the third, fourth, fifth time, your immune system is attacking those tissues. We also know through a recent paper that the third time you get the jab, the type of antibody will switch. It's called class switching, and the antibody switch from what they call an IgG1 antibody to an IgG4. This IgG4 antibody that you develop on the third dose is more like the type of antibody you would develop from a repeated exposure to an allergen, where your immune system becomes tolerant of it. So how you can outgrow an allergy, or you can, if you have an allergy, you can go to the doctor and they'll give you repeated injections of small amounts. Your immune system becomes used to it, and it's the IgG4 switch that takes place where that antibody will basically keep all the other antibodies from calling out the rest of the immune system to attack
Right.
what it is. So the IgG4 blocks those other antibodies by binding to the antigen, and then
So
it's got a higher
that's doing the
affinity.
opposite of what you would want your body to do, right? Where you would want your
Right.
antibodies
So
to attack.
basically, yeah. So then, if you keep injecting people with this spike protein over and over and over again 5 times, their body's going to eventually become immune tolerant of the spike protein, and so when they get infected with coronaviruses, their body will just allow it to infect their body.
Yeah.
So will these people be subject to persistent virus that doesn't clear out of their body because now they become immune tolerant from this class switching to the IgG4? So that's a new development, and it's kind of shocked some people actually when they saw that data. When that data came out, actually the authors are like, "Whoa!" If you read their paper, you can read it. You can. I'm paraphrasing, but they're like, "Whoa, this is not good." A lot of these people that are publishing the papers, you'll read the paper and they'll have this data that's like, wow, this looks really bad for the vaccine. And then they'll come out with their statement in either the abstract or the conclusion that says, still, the risk outweigh the benefits.
Yeah.
And everyone should get, they all make that statement because they want the paper to be published. And if they don't say that statement, it won't be published.
Yeah.
So they'll all come out and say, well, the risk outweigh the risk, the benefits outweigh the risks. And, but they don't show any data or any math around that. They just say that statement, and then they get their paper published.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you've paid any attention to those who have contradicted the official narrative, we've seen what happens to them being deplatformed. You could say things 2 years ago and be shut down completely on social media, where now that's common knowledge. I mean, it's what was the most recent Lancet article where CBS, I think, finally published, or NBC, one of the two, made a reference to it recently that showed it was a meta-analysis, which, for those, a meta-analysis, correct me if I'm wrong, but looks at many different studies and then tries to draw a conclusion based off of what, not just one study, but overall, what's the trend of all these studies? They all saying the same thing. And this meta-analysis showed that natural immunity from recovery from it was as long-lasting or longer and as effective or more effective than from the vaccine. Is that correct? Do you remember that article? Have you seen that? Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct. And there's lots of studies leading up to that study, and it's good to have a meta-analysis that basically summarizes all the previous studies. But you
could have lost your job if you were a doctor or a physician. I mean, literally, there were hospitals disassociating themselves from doctors and physicians that were saying things of that nature. And now that's common knowledge. Apparently.
Yeah, I remember when the first paper came out in 2020 about natural immunity working.
Yeah.
It was like everybody was shocked that we had this thing called natural immunity. As everybody was feigning ignorance and pretending like the natural immune system didn't exist. And it was like, let's give these people a Nobel Prize because they had discovered we have this thing, natural immunity, we didn't even know existed. They were just playing dumb. And everyone else was saying, what about natural immunity? Because we have, like I said before, cross-reactive immunity from these other 4 coronaviruses. We have innate immunity that don't even have to be previously exposed to a virus to have an innate immunity to it.
Yeah.
And plus, we've been exposed to these other 4 coronaviruses. We already have a pretty good, robust, adaptive and innate immune system that's able to deal with the coronavirus. And that's why the infection fatality ratios were so low.
Yeah.
In my age bracket was 0.08%. If we didn't have innate and adaptive immunity that was already in place, it would be 100%.
Yeah.
We would all die from that. We would all have died from the coronavirus if we didn't already have some type of immunity to be able to deal with it. But obviously we did because we're all still here, So, and a lot of us didn't get the vaccine. And so they pretended like we didn't have this thing called natural immunity and made people believe the only way to have immunity to this virus is to get injected with this new technology.
Yeah.
And so I think the failure of our education system, there's not enough in high schools and in education system to teach people about immunity or about natural health or about how your body works. You take a biology class in high school, you learn about plants, you learn about frogs, but they really don't teach you about how your system works. And so you have a lot of people walking around that don't know these things, so that when the media comes out and says these things, they don't know to say, wait a second, that doesn't sound right. You
Yeah.
know. But again, it was a fear thing. And again, at the beginning, I was afraid of this virus. It had worked on me, and I had lots of education. It had worked on me for a couple of months at least. And then, once you start to reason and look at these things, you see the patterns, you see what's going on. It becomes much easier to come out of it. Now, I think there's still people that are in the fight or flight fear response from this whole thing because they've been fed a steady diet of CNN and these other news media that aren't telling them the complete truth, and they haven't really spent any time to go look outside of that information or body of knowledge to do their own education. And because of that, they're still being fed this fear. And so I can't blame people like that. People that are continuing to operate by fear, I completely understand that. But at some point, if somebody comes up to you and says, you don't have to be afraid, and here's the reasons why, you should take a serious look at that.
Yeah, that's good. And I think that may be the thread that ties the two parts of our conversation together. We going back to the physics of light and how that reveals the nature of God and his attributes, and how you came to know that and understand that and have those insights. And then how you have your experience has been through this pandemic and what you've learned. The search for truth, I think, is so important in every person's life, and we cannot expect that we'll be spoon-fed everything that we need to know. That's I believe that God created us to be truth seekers in every area of life, whether that's with health, whether it's with news, whether it's with the Bible, whether it's with science and physics. I think that there has to be a diligence to find truth and to look at all sources and consider things and use reason and use thought, and to suppress that fearful response that you talked about. Now, fear has a place, right? And if I step out on a busy highway, I should be afraid that I'm going to get hit by a car because there's a high likelihood of that, and that fear keeps me safe. But when I allow that fear to continue and to take up residence inside of my mind and my thoughts, and then to dictate my actions and my responses rather than peace-driven critical thinking, then I think we see the results of that around us. So I guess wrapping it up, do you have any thoughts toward those that, what are your suggestions? How do you do that? How do you find sources of information that are reputable? How do you get over the fear? What are your thoughts toward, I guess, to encourage the listener, whoever's listening to this podcast, here's like a practical step that you can take moving forward, maybe something that has helped you, or just something that you've seen in general. Like, how do we get past the fear and continue to search for truth and know when we find it? Because there's so many competing narratives. All I'm asking you for is the answer to life.
So the way you don't do it is go to Google and type in what you want to know, especially around coronavirus. Maybe with some other topics, it's okay. But if you go to Google and you type in vaccine safety, vaccine adverse event, they've already filtered it and they're in on it. So Google and the big search engines, they're only showing you things that will tell you to go take the vaccine.
Yep.
They'll drive you to the CDC website. So you can't find that truth there. So you have to go elsewhere. Where can you find it? You can go to Twitter. There's tons of doctors on Twitter.
Yeah.
That, medical doctors, MDs that have been practicing medicine, like Dr. McCullough. Tons of others that are posting on Twitter their findings. They're posting on Twitter. The research reports are either writing or reading and summarizing, and they're spreading that out there on Twitter. It's the best place I know where people are actually able to spread it. You can't see it. You can't find it on Facebook. You can't find it on Instagram, because those two platforms will immediately censor anything you write that isn't basically saying go take the vaccine. If you say anything against that,
Yeah.
you will be shut down. It's happened to me. It's happened to others. You cannot get that information out there on those two platforms, but you can get it out on Twitter. So I would encourage people is to get on Twitter and start looking up doctors that are talking about these things. Like if you come to me, science, my handle, I think, is Science W for with. I can't spell it the whole word. So it's Science W, Dr. Doug.
Yeah.
Look up that handle.
I'll post it on this video too, so everybody can see it.
Yeah. So I'm following people that so if you look at the people I'm following, you'll see some of these doctors, and then go look at them and who they're following.
Yeah.
And start to follow these people and get some information coming through for Twitter. Now, when you find somebody posting something on Twitter, you can go look up the journal articles. You can go click on the link to the article, and you can go read the journal article.
Yeah.
But again, you're not going to find it by searching on Google or something like that. So that's what I would ask you to do.
Yeah. It's a little bit of work, but I would have been.
There's a ton of censorship out there. And when Elon Musk took over Twitter, it changed the game. I was able to post things on Twitter before Elon Musk took over, and I almost got shut down a couple times, but I had to be very careful how I worded things.
Yeah.
What I said. But there was other people who had their home, like, what's his name? My main went blank. He had 500,000 followers. Dr. Malone.
But Dr. Malone, Robert Malone, yeah.
Yeah, so he had 500,000. I had to shut down his whole account.
Yeah.
And he had to move over to Telegram.
Yeah.
But then he came back. He was able to come back after Twitter restored his account when Elon Musk took over. So they're not censoring COVID information anymore on Twitter.
Yeah.
Which is good. Let people make up their own mind. Let them look at the information. We're all big people who can think for ourselves. Let us consume the information and make our own decisions. Don't let fact checkers make our decisions for us.
Yeah.
A lot of times these fact checkers, we don't even know who they are, what kind of education they have. And they're getting paid $12 an hour or something. And they might only have a college degree, and they're over here telling this MD he can't say you can use ivermectin.
Right.
That was the other thing with this whole thing was they started censoring, other remedies that work, like ivermectin and vitamin D. Like there's tons of studies out now that show if you had low vitamin D, you had a bad outcome with COVID.
Yeah.
Like meta studies.
Yeah.
Statistics around them and everything. It's conclusive. There's no doubt that if you had low vitamin D levels, you had a bad outcome with COVID. And if you had higher vitamin D levels, you had a better outcome, much better outcome. And so why wasn't the government telling people to take vitamin D? And why were they censoring people that were trying to tell people to take vitamin D?
That's right. Yeah, we didn't even get into that, but there's so many different problems. I mean, deep problems with what's happened over the past few years. I found Dr. John Campbell out of the UK, and somehow I think it was because he was brilliant enough to say things without saying them explicitly a lot of times, and his YouTube channel has remained up surprisingly. But he was the first one that I saw talk about ivermectin, and he goes through and shows the pharmacological mechanism of how it works, and he explains it in a way, again, as a layperson, it's very clear, and he references each study, and I clicked through and I looked at the studies myself, and I said, yeah, this makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, all of those alternative therapies were being suppressed. So there's just so many wrong things that happen.
Why, if you think about why suppress it? I mean, even if you thought, hey, there's really nothing to this won't work.
Yeah.
Why not let people do it? Like, there's no harm in taking vitamin D, is there? I mean, every health study says, hey, it's good to take vitamin D. So why tell people not to?
Yeah.
Why were they blocking these things? You got to ask the question, why?
Yeah.
What's your rationale? What's your motivation here to tell people not to take vitamin D? And so that happened over and over with zinc.
Yeah.
And with ivermectin, and these other things. So things that could have really saved people's lives, they weren't really interested in saving people's lives. They were only interested in making sure everybody got this new vaccine.
Yeah.
That was it. We weren't going to hear anything else other than that.
Yep.
So the only way, to answer your question, get on Twitter. It's the best platform to get information right now.
Yeah.
I'm going to do
I was going to say, I'm going to do a podcast where I go through, it might be a boring podcast for some, but I'm going to go through some of the doctors and individuals and scientists and stuff that I've followed and some of the things that they demonstrated. There's just so many. And again, I know I'm thinking like, if I didn't have Twitter over the past few years, I would have been in the same boat as everybody else, just hearing bits and pieces, but not having actual evidence to sort through and look at for myself. So we're here talking about Twitter, but like you mentioned, it wasn't like Twitter was an open, playground over the last few years. You had to be very careful even about what you said and how you said it. So I'll end it with this. In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus is talking about the end times. And as I keep going back to that passage here recently, the idea of the deception that he talks about, of how deep the deception will be at that time, it seems like, well, there's a verse that says if it were possible, even the elect would be deceived. That's going to be how pervasive I don't want to use the term misinformation because of the way that's been used lately, but the deception, how pervasive the deception would be in those times. So I think more than ever, if you claim to be a follower of Christ, you've got to listen to the Holy Spirit. You got to pray, and you've got to think. God gave us a brain for a reason, and it's our duty and our responsibility, I think, to search for truth in every area of life. So I would just encourage you, as we close this podcast out, to do that. Do it as Dr. Doug said. Jump on Twitter if you haven't made an account. And you can follow him. I'll post his Twitter handle on there. And follow the Somewhat Helpful podcast. I think I have maybe one follower at this time, so we'll build that up. But anyway, I hope this podcast has been helpful to you. I really do. There's just so many different angles to this. We could spend hours and hours talking about it, but I like talking to individuals such as yourself, Doctor, because everybody has a little bit of a different story, and everybody has usually a little bit sharper understanding of particular angles of it. So thank you very much for sharing your perspective and your insight. And I do believe that people will be better informed after listening to this podcast and better equipped to seek truth in every area of their life. So thank you very much. And do not forget to pick up this amazing book that you will not regret.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a pleasure being on the show, and I wish you the greatest with it. And thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you next time on the Somewhat Helpful Podcast.